A single drop of crimson was all it took to detonate her life. Maya Haddad, a 27-year-old waitress quietly suffocating under a mountain of medical debt from her late father's illness, watched the ruby bead of vintage Bordeaux tremble on the edge of the silver tray. An imperceptible tremor in her hand, born of exhaustion, sent it plummeting onto a pristine architectural blueprint belonging to Elias Vance, a titan of technology whose net worth could absorb the national debt of a small country. Her manager, a weasel of a man named Gregory, began to physically shrink in terror. But as Maya rushed to blot the stain, Vance leaned toward his lawyer and began to speak in a coarse, rapid-fire Lebanese Arabic, a dialect thick with the grit of the Beirut streets. He called her a clumsy peasant, mocking her station, her life, her very existence. He assumed the woman in the black apron was just part of the scenery. He assumed she was deaf to his ancestral tongue. What he never could have fathomed was that Maya's debt was the ruinous cost of a nearly completed PhD in Semitic paleography and Islamic art history. She straightened up from the table, her spine turning to steel, and met his cold, dismissive gaze. The words that emerged from her lips next, spoken in the purest, most classical Arabic, a language of poets and kings, didn't just shatter the silence in the room. They were about to dismantle his world and build her a new one from the wreckage. The low electronic chime of the service call sounded like a death knell in the hushed, opulent dining room of Aurelia. It was the sound that governed Maya's days, a digital whip cracking over the symphony of clinking crystal and muffled, self-important laughter. At 8 p.m. on a Thursday, the restaurant was in its prime, a theater of power where deals were sealed over plates of food that cost more than her monthly rent. The air was thick with the scent of seared wagyu, truffle oil, and the dry, papery smell of generational wealth. Maya moved through the labyrinth of tables with an economy of motion that belied her exhaustion. She was carrying a tray laden with antique brandy snifters, each one a delicate glass bubble that seemed to hold the candlelight within it. By every academic standard, Maya was extraordinary. Her unfinished dissertation on Kufic script variations in early Umayyad architecture was considered groundbreaking by the few professors who'd seen it. She could debate the nuances of calligraphic styles from Damascus to Cordoba, discerning the hand of a master from a mere apprentice in a single glance. She was also $180,000 in debt, a figure that felt more like a life sentence than a number. This crushing, ever-present weight was why she was here, at Aurelia, the jewel of downtown Boston's dining scene, wearing a uniform that felt like a costume and forcing a smile for people who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Haddad, table 9 needs another bottle of the 82 Latour. The Vance party is in the private salon. For God's sake, don't trip. Gregory's voice was a greasy whisper in her ear as he slid past her, his face a mask of anxious perspiration. He was a man who managed through a cocktail of fear and sycophancy, bowing to the patrons and bullying the staff with equal fervor. The Vance party? Maya asked, a knot tightening in her stomach. The name echoed in the city's financial pages and gossip columns. Elias Vance, Vance Innovations. The man was a local legend, a second-generation Lebanese-American who had built a software empire from nothing. He was known for two things, his genius and his utter ruthlessness. Yes, the Vance party, Gregory hissed, adjusting his bow tie as if it were choking him. He's with his lawyer, Arthur Finch. Vance is a patron, Maya, a major one. That means you are invisible. You are silent. You anticipate. You do not exist. Is that clear? Crystal, Gregory, Maya replied, her voice carefully neutral. And don't make eye contact. He hates it, Gregory added, a final, pathetic edict before he scurried away toward the maitre d'. Maya took a moment, steadying her hands by the service station. Her friend Chloe, another waitress navigating the treacherous waters of student debt, came beside her, polishing silverware with furious energy. You got Vance? My condolences, Chloe murmured, not looking up. Last time he was in, he sent his lobster bisque back because the swirling cream on top was counterclockwise. Said it was inauspicious. Gregory nearly had an aneurysm. Counterclockwise? Maya breathed. You're kidding. With a man like that, the universe bends to his will, right down to the direction of his soup garnish, Chloe said, her tone grim. Just be a ghost, Maya. Float in, float out. Maya nodded, but the familiar acidic taste of resentment rose in her throat. 6 years of her life, buried in the dust of ancient libraries, deciphering texts that had been silent for 1,000 years. She had traced the elegant flow of ink on brittle parchment, her heart pounding with the thrill of connection to a long-dead scribe. Now, her most pressing professional concern was the rotational preference of a billionaire's soup. She retrieved the bottle of wine from the cellar, a dusty relic that cost more than her father's first car. Cradling it like a newborn, she pushed open the heavy mahogany door to the private salon. The room was a pocket of profound silence. Two men sat at a large circular table. One, Arthur Finch, was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a weary, intelligent face. He wore a perfectly tailored tweed jacket that seemed out of place in the sea of modern black suits. The other, facing away from the door, was Elias Vance. When he turned slightly to speak to Finch, Maya got her first clear look at him. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 40, with a severe, handsome face, dark hair showing the first hints of silver at the temples, and eyes that seemed to burn with a cold, restless energy. He was dressed in a dark, brutally simple suit, but he wore it like a general wore his uniform. The air around him crackled with an impatience so profound it felt like a distortion in the atmosphere. Spread across the table between them was not food, but a large rolled-out architectural drawing. "The 1982 Chateau Latour, gentlemen," Maya said, her voice a practiced, unobtrusive murmur. Vance didn't acknowledge her. He merely gestured impatiently at the blueprint with a long, elegant finger, deep in conversation with Finch. Maya moved with the silent grace she had perfected over 2 years of servitude. She presented the bottle to Finch, the designated host, who gave it a cursory, knowledgeable nod. She performed the ritual, the careful cutting of the foil, the extraction of the cork, the pouring of a small taste for Finch's approval. Finch swirled the dark liquid, inhaled its bouquet, and nodded again. "Excellent." Maya moved to pour for Vance. She held the heavy bottle, her wrist angled just so. The rich, dark wine flowed in a silent, perfect stream into his glass. She then moved to fill Finch's glass. Everything was perfect. She was a ghost. She was almost safe. And then it happened. As she pulled the bottle back, her cuff, starched and unforgiving, caught the edge of the silver tray she'd placed on the credenza behind her. The tray tilted. A single heavy snifter, filled earlier with ice water for Vance, slid silently and inexorably toward the edge. Maya saw it in slow motion. The condensation on the glass, the way it caught the light, its graceful, terrible arc through the air. It landed on the table with a muffled thud, not shattering, but sending a wave of ice water across the polished wood. The water wasn't the problem. The problem was the drop of red wine that had been clinging to the lip of the bottle in her hand. Shaken by the noise, her hand jerked. A single fat crimson droplet flew from the bottle and landed squarely in the center of the blueprint. It bloomed instantly on the absorbent paper, a tiny obscene flower of red on a field of white and blue lines. The world stopped. Elias Vance stopped talking mid-sentence. Arthur Finch froze, his wine glass halfway to his lips. The silence that fell was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, a physical presence in the room. Vance slowly, deliberately, lowered his gaze from Finch's face to the blueprint. He stared at the red stain. 1 second. 2. 5. Then he lifted his eyes and looked at Maya. It wasn't the explosive rage she had expected. It was something far, far worse. A calm, surgical contempt. A look of such profound dismissal that it felt like an erasure. "Gregory," he said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, resonant command that sliced through the room, and it seemed through the very wood of the door. Maya's blood turned to ice. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. The drop of wine wasn't even on him. It was on a piece of paper that was probably worth more than her life. The door burst open and Gregory scrambled in, his face the color of spoiled milk. "Mr. Vance, is everything acceptable? My deepest apologies." "This server," Vance said, the word server dripping with a poison that Gregory was all too eager to ingest, "is incompetent. We are in the middle of a delicate discussion, and I have to be disturbed by this clumsiness. He gestured toward Maya with a flick of his wrist, as if shooing an insect. Sir, I am so sorry, Maya began, her voice trembling. Quiet, Gregory hissed, his eyes wide with a feral panic. He whipped a silk handkerchief from his pocket and began dabbing frantically at the red stain, smearing it into a grotesque pink smudge. I apologize, Mr. Vance. A million apologies. It will never happen again. She will be removed from your presence this instant. Vance leaned back, his cold eyes still locked on Maya. He took in her flushed face, her dark hair pulled back in a tight, severe bun, the way her hands were clenched at her sides. He looked at her not as a person, but as a specimen, a symbol of everything he found aggravating in the world. Then he turned to Arthur Finch, let out a short, derisive sound, not quite a laugh, but a puff of disbelief, and began to speak. He switched to Arabic, but it wasn't the formal, elegant language of news broadcasts or literature. It was a raw, street-level Lebanese dialect, peppered with cynical slang. He spoke with the absolute certainty that he was in a private club of two. Hada huwa al-mushkila bihada al-balad, he said, his voice a venomous rasp. This is the problem with this country. Bi salmu shugul al-kibar lawlad, bitarif, hay al-bent, akla ad al-farag ilifa. They give the work of adults to children, you know? This girl, her mind is as empty as the space in it. He gestured vaguely at her with his chin. Misharfa hatatkub lamai, ba'id bishak izabta reif tikra. She doesn't even know how to pour water. I'd be surprised if she can even read. He smirked at Finch, expecting a shared moment of condescending amusement. Finch, to his immense credit, just looked down at his lap, a faint flush of shame on his cheeks. Vance glanced back at Maya, who stood rooted to the spot, a statue of humiliation. He added one last casual shard of glass. Bash shayliha min wajha. Just get her out of my sight. Gregory, hearing the flow of a foreign language, produced a weak, nervous smile, assuming it was some private business matter. Right away, Mr. Vance. Haddad, you're finished. My office, now. He turned his back, expecting her to follow like a whipped dog, but Maya didn't move. In the silent, hollow space where her fear had been, something else was kindling. It wasn't just the insult. It was the culmination of everything. The years of study, the smell of the hospital where her father faded away, the endless nights calculating figures she could never hope to pay. It was the crushing, cosmic irony of being called an ignorant, empty-headed peasant in the very cultural sphere she had dedicated her adult life to understanding. The specific regional dialect he was using, she had spent 3 months in a village in the Kadisha Valley, meticulously documenting its idiomatic expressions for a paper she had presented at a symposium. He thought she couldn't read. She could read the ghost of a scribe's intention in the curve of a 7th century consonant. Elias Vance had already turned back to his blueprint, dismissing her so completely from his reality that she might as well have ceased to exist. Finch was studiously examining his wine. Gregory was holding the door. Maya took one single, calming breath. The panic was gone, burned away by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. She did not address Gregory. She did not address Finch. She spoke directly to the back of Elias Vance's head. Her voice was not loud, but it resonated with the flawless, classical Arabic of the Quran, a stark and beautiful contrast to the street slang he had used. Sayyida iftiraduka fodagairi mahali. Sir, your assumption is incorrect. The effect was like a switch being thrown, cutting all power and sound in the universe. Gregory's hand froze on the doorknob. Arthur Finch's head shot up, his eyes wide with disbelief, his mouth slightly agape. Elias Vance, who had been pointing at the smudged blueprint, froze absolutely still. His hand hovered in the air. His entire body went rigid, as if he'd been struck by lightning. Maya continued, her voice gaining strength, imbued with the quiet, unshakable authority of a scholar correcting a novice. Aqlwa Elisa bifarig, she said, her diction perfect. My mind is not empty. Wafu al-hakka ana astat ul-qira. And in fact, I am able to read. She allowed herself a small, deliberate glance at the papers on the table. أستات قراءة المخططات على طاولتك. أستات قراءة شر المتنبأ. وبكل تأكيد أستات قراءة شخصياتك التي كشفتها للجميع. I can read the blueprints on your table. I can read the poetry of Al-Mutanabi, and I can most certainly read your character, which you have just laid bare for all to see. Elias Vance turned his head. He moved like an automaton, his motions slow and jerky. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a pallid, waxy mask of shock. The arrogance, the power, the brutal impatience, it all vanished, replaced by a raw, unadulterated astonishment. He stared at her as if she were an apparition. Gregory, hearing this incomprehensible stream of language, spun around, his face mottling with red patches of fury and confusion. "Haddad, what in the name of all that is holy do you think you're doing? I told you to get out." Maya ignored him. Her gaze was locked with Vance's, and then she delivered the final precise strike. She switched from the classical tongue to the very same coarse, regional Lebanese dialect he had used to insult her. The transition was seamless, her accent flawless. "Wa haidal khat," she said, nodding at the blueprint. "L'khat al-kufa ili am tistamiluhun galat." And this calligraphy, the Kufic script you're using here, it's wrong. Hada mish uslub la asr la umawim. Hada taqlad Uthman ورقوق كمان. بيبينا أنك بستفيق كتير مش أنك فاهم شعري. This isn't the style of the Umayyad period. It's an Ottoman imitation, and a clumsy one at that. It shows you paid a lot, not that you understand anything. Arthur Finch made a sound like a strangled gasp. He understood. He understood enough to know what was happening. Elias Vance simply stared, his world visibly tilting on its axis. This waitress, this non-entity, this clumsy peasant, had not only understood his private, gutter-level insult, she had answered it in the language of scholars, corrected his grammar, dissected his character, and then, as a final crushing blow, had critiqued the multi-million-dollar project on his table in his own childhood dialect. "What is going on here?" Gregory shrieked, finally finding his voice. "Are you harassing this guest, Haddad? I'll have you arrested." Maya finally broke her intense gaze from Vance and turned her cool eyes to her manager. She switched back to pristine, unaccented English. "Mr. Vance was making an observation, Gregory. He commented in Arabic that I was an empty-headed child who couldn't read. He made certain assumptions based on my uniform." Gregory's eyes darted between Maya's calm face and Vance's thunderstruck one. "Mr. Vance, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. She's being hysterical. She is not mistaken." The voice was Elias Vance's. It was quiet, strained, hollow. He was still pale, but the shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a terrifying, rapid-fire series of calculations, firing behind his eyes. He was no longer looking at her, he was seeing her. She understood every word. Gregory's professional universe imploded. He gaped at Maya as if she had just confessed to a murder. You speak?" "I was 3 seminars short of a doctorate in the subject," Maya said simply. You're fired." Gregory finally managed to sputter, his finger trembling as he pointed at the door. "Fired. Insubordination. Eavesdropping on a private conversation. Get out. Clean out your locker and get out of my restaurant." Maya looked at Gregory's pathetic, terrified face. Then she looked back at Vance. He was just watching her, his expression now utterly unreadable. He didn't intervene. He didn't defend her. He didn't stop her manager. He just watched, his mind clearly working at a furious pace. A bitter smile almost touched Maya's lips. Of course. What had she really expected? A sudden champion of the working class? He was Elias Vance. She was the help who had profoundly embarrassed him in front of his lawyer. "Fine," Maya said. She reached behind her back and untied the strings of the black apron, the symbol of her servitude and her failure. She folded it into a neat, crisp square and placed it on the credenza. "My final paycheck can be mailed," she said to Gregory, her voice steady. She then looked directly at Elias Vance. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Vance," she said in perfect English, Then she leaned forward just enough for only him and Finch to hear, and whispered in flawless, classical Arabic, Wa atamana lakal tawfuk fa mathafik, satatajile. And I wish you good luck with your museum. You're going to need it. She turned and walked out of the room. She did not run. She did not slam the door. She closed it with a soft, final click, leaving Elias Vance and Arthur Finch in the deafening silence she had created. The cold Boston air hit Maya like a physical blow as she stepped out of Aurelia's grand entrance. The doorman stared at her, surprised to see her leaving through the front. The reality of her actions descended upon her, heavy and cold as the November night. Fired, unemployed. Rent was due in 10 days. Her mother's prescription copays were piling up. The mountain of debt from her father's futile cancer treatments loomed, casting a shadow over her entire existence. That single blazing moment of defiance in the salon, which had felt so righteous, so powerful, now seemed like an act of catastrophic self-sabotage. She had stood up to a billionaire, and for what? The privilege of being homeless. Pride, she thought bitterly, was a luxury she couldn't afford. She went home to the small, third-floor walk-up in Somerville she shared with her mother, Eleanor. The apartment was filled with books, the smell of her mother's lemon tea, and the quiet dignity of making do. Eleanor was in her worn armchair, a book in her lap, her face etched with a gentle worry that had become permanent since Maya's father passed. "You're home early," Eleanor said, her voice soft. Maya couldn't hold it in. The story came pouring out. The wine, the blueprint, the ugly words, her own reckless response. She finished, expecting a lecture on practicality. Instead, her mother reached out and took her hand. Eleanor's hands were soft, but her grip was firm. "Your father would have been so proud," she said quietly. "He hated that you had to give up your work for that place. He always said your mind was a garden, and they had you pulling weeds." "But Mama, I was fired. The bills." "We will manage," Eleanor said with a certainty Maya didn't feel. "We always do. You stood up for yourself, Maya. You used the gift he worked so hard to help you cultivate. That is never a mistake." For the next 2 days, Maya lived in a gray fog of anxiety. She scoured online job boards, her heart sinking with every click. She was overqualified for service jobs, underqualified for academic positions that demanded a completed PhD and a list of publications. She sent her resume to translation agencies, but they wanted corporate or government experience, not expertise in ancient calligraphy. The automated rejection emails started piling up. It felt as though she were trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. On the third morning, the buzzer for her apartment shrieked, making her jump. It was a weekday morning. No one ever came by. She pressed the intercom. "Yes?" "A delivery for Ms. Maya Haddad," a crisp, formal voice said. Confused, she buzzed him in. A few moments later, there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find a courier in a sharp uniform holding a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. She signed for it, her hand unsteady. The envelope was heavy, the paper of a quality she had only ever seen in museums. There was no return address. Inside was a single folded sheet of the same paper. It was a note, but not typed. It was written by hand in a breathtakingly elegant yet forceful Diwani script. It read, in Arabic, "Your assessment was correct. My understanding was flawed. Your presence is requested. A car will be waiting downstairs at 3 p.m. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be one. She knew that handwriting. It was the same bold, decisive hand that had been making notes on the blueprint. It was from Elias Vance. Her first instinct was terror. He was going to sue her. He was going to threaten her, blacklist her from every job in the city. Her mother saw her pale face. "What is it, dear?" "It's him," Maya whispered. "He wants to see me." "Then you must go," Eleanor said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. Look him in the eye, just as you did then." At precisely 3 p.m., a black Audi A8, sleek and silent as a shark, purred to a stop in front of her building. A driver in a dark suit opened the rear door without a word. Maya, dressed in the only interview outfit she owned, a simple black dress and a worn but clean blazer, slid into the cool leather interior. The car smelled of wealth and insulation from the problems of the world. It pulled away from the curb, leaving her neighborhood of triple-deckers and corner stores behind as it headed toward the gleaming steel and glass heart of the city. The car didn't take her to an office building. It drove to a discreet private garage beneath a modern, elegant building in the back bay. The driver led her not to a lobby, but to a private elevator. It ascended silently, opening directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment that looked more like an art gallery than a home. The walls were white, the furniture was minimalist and severe, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, godlike view of the Charles River and the city beyond. Elias Vance stood by the window, his back to her, looking out over his kingdom. Arthur Finch sat in a leather armchair, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Leave us," Vance said to the driver, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing Maya inside with the two men. Vance turned. His face was unreadable, a mask of cool neutrality. The fiery contempt from the restaurant was gone, replaced by an unnerving, analytical intensity. He looked at her as if she were a complex equation he was trying to solve. "Ms. Haddad," he began, his English precise. "Please, sit." Maya chose a straight-back chair opposite Finch, refusing the plush sofa. She would not be made comfortable. She would not be put at ease. "Last Thursday, you embarrassed me," Vance said, getting straight to the point. "You were insubordinate. By any conventional measure, your manager was right to fire you." Maya said nothing. She met his gaze and held it. "However," Vance continued, walking slowly toward the center of the room, "you also pointed out a significant and very expensive flaw in a project that is of great personal importance to me." He gestured to a massive table where the same blueprint, now professionally restored, but with the faint ghost of the wine, the faint spectral ghost of the wine stain was the first thing Maya noticed. It was a pale, pinkish shadow on the restored blueprint, a phantom of the moment her life had detonated. The paper, once absorbent and vulnerable, was now reinforced, sealed under a protective laminate. But the memory of the wound remained. It was a fitting metaphor for the man who now stood opposite her across the immense rosewood table. His own meticulously constructed facade showing the faintest traces of a past he had tried to erase. Elias Vance gestured towards it, not with the impatient flick of the wrist she remembered, but with a quiet, deliberate indication. "The new wing of the Museum of Fine Arts," he stated, his voice a low baritone that was absorbed by the soundproofed walls of his penthouse. "The Islamic Patronage Gallery, funded entirely by my foundation." He paused, his dark analytical eyes pinning her in place. They were not cruel as they had been in the restaurant, nor were they dismissive. They were something far more unsettling, intensely curious, as if she were a rare, untranslatable text he was determined to decipher. "My architects, along with a team of consultants from two of the most prestigious universities in this country, assured me that this calligraphy," he pointed to the offending section, his finger hovering just above the phantom stain, "was historically accurate. You, Ms. Haddad, in the process of being terminated from a position you clearly despised, claimed it was not. Arthur has spent the last 72 hours in a state of caffeinated panic, consulting with a different set of experts, the ones who aren't on my payroll. They have, after much academic prevarication, confirmed your assertion. It is, and I am quoting a rather terrified professor from Oxford, an aesthetically displeasing and anachronistic pastiche, a clumsy Ottoman imitation." He spoke the final words as if they were shards of glass in his mouth, the personal and professional insult stinging him anew. "I am building a legacy, Ms. Haddad, not a theme park. I am paying for perfection, and I received sycophantic incompetence. You, on the other hand, delivered a brutal but precise diagnosis for free, while under considerable duress." Arthur Finch, looking exhausted and profoundly out of his element in this sterile, high-tech eyrie, cleared his throat. "Ms. Haddad, what my client is attempting to convey is that we find ourselves in a unique and rather delicate position. We have a multi-million-dollar problem, and you, it would appear, possess a very specific and exceptionally rare solution." "I don't want a solution, Arthur," Vance cut in, his voice sharp and incisive. "Solutions are for broken pipes. I want truth. I want authenticity." He turned his full, undivided attention back to Maya, and the air in the room seemed to compress. I am not going to offer you your waitress job back. I made a call to Aurelia yesterday. Gregory is no longer the manager. A thorough review of his employment practices is underway. I do not tolerate incompetence, and I have a particular distaste for men who build their own fragile sense of authority by terrorizing those they deem beneath them. Maya felt a flicker of shock, but it was quickly subsumed by a deep, abiding caution. This was not an act of chivalry. This was Elias Vance tidying up a loose end, erasing an imperfection that had touched his world. That is not why you are here, Vance continued, his tone clinical. I did not bring you here to offer you a settlement for your wrongful dismissal, though Mr. Finch, ever the pragmatist, has a rather generous one drawn up should you prefer to simply take the money and disappear. He nodded towards a leather briefcase by Finch's chair, a silent, tempting offer of escape. I brought you here to offer you a position, not as a server, not as a consultant who can be overruled. I want you to run this project. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound that Maya could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, the distant, muffled sigh of the city below. Run it, she finally whispered, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. You will be given the title of Project Director for Historical Authenticity, a title we will create. You will report directly and only to me. You will have absolute, final, and non-negotiable authority on every aesthetic, historical, and cultural detail of this gallery. My architects, my curators, my acquisitions team, they will all answer to you in these matters. You will be given an office, an unlimited budget for research and travel, and access to every resource my foundation can provide. In return, you will ensure that when this gallery opens, it is not merely beautiful, it will be true. It will be the most perfect, most authentic, most intellectually rigorous collection of its kind in the world. He named a salary. It was an obscene number, a figure so far removed from her reality of late fees and ramen noodles that it sounded like a line from a science fiction film. It was a number that would not only erase her debt, but obliterate the very memory of it. It was a number that would buy her mother a house, a garden, a life free from the quiet, gnawing anxiety of every bill. It was the key to a cage she hadn't even realized she was in. Why? The word was out before she could stop it. It was a small, fragile sound in the vast, opulent room. Why me? You could hire anyone. The world's foremost experts. Because I already have, Vance interrupted, a sliver of his old, cold arrogance surfacing. I hired the legends. I hired the tenured professors with names like monuments. And they either told me what they thought I wanted to hear, or their expertise has been calcified by theory. They looked at these plans and saw nothing wrong. You, he took a step closer, looked at them while your world was collapsing and saw the truth. More than that, you spoke it. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and you spoke it anyway. I don't value obedience, Ms. Haddad. I find it common and cheap. I value excellence, and I value the courage it takes to defend it. You, it appears, possess a surplus of both. The question is, are you willing to work for a man who so thoroughly misjudged you? It was a direct challenge, a test disguised as a question. He wasn't apologizing. He was assessing her again, looking for a different kind of strength. Maya thought of her mother's words, then of the quiet dignity in her voice. Your father would have been so proud. This wasn't just a job. It was the culmination of her father's belief in her, a resurrection of a life she had been forced to mourn while still living. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without flinching. I have two conditions. Arthur Finch shifted nervously, but a flicker of something, not amusement, but respect, ignited in Vance's eyes. Proceed. First, Maya said, her voice gathering a strength she didn't know she possessed, my authority will not be a suggestion. It will be a mandate. The moment one of your architects or curators attempts to circumvent my decision by appealing to you, your immediate and unequivocal response will be to support me. There can be no cracks in that foundation, or the entire structure will be worthless. I will not spend my time fighting internal politics. If I had any intention of undermining you, Ms. Haddad, I would have kept the consultants who agreed with me. Your authority will be absolute. What is the second condition? Maya took a deep breath. This was the one that mattered. Every 6 months, a report will be submitted to you by me, detailing the progress of this project. You will read it, and then you and I will walk through the construction site together, and you will address me and any other person on the site in Arabic. Finch looked utterly bewildered. Vance, however, grew very still. The analytical curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, piercing focus. He understood. This wasn't about language preference. This was about memory. It was about respect. It was about forcing him, again and again, to remember the foundation of their partnership. A moment of profound disrespect, now repurposed as a tool of accountability. She was demanding that he never be allowed to forget who she was or how he had first seen her. A long moment passed. The city breathed outside the glass walls. "Accepted, Director Haddad," Elias Vance said finally, the new title rolling off his tongue with a deliberate, formal weight. "Welcome to the project." The next 6 months were a brutal, exhilarating blur. Maya moved not into a flashy condo, but into a quiet, sunlit apartment in a brownstone near the museum, a place with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, and a small study where her father's books, long in storage, could finally breathe. She paid off the mountain of debt in a single wire transfer, an act so cathartic it left her feeling dizzy and light. Her first meeting with the architectural team was a trial by fire. The lead architect, Marcus Thorne, a man whose celebrity was matched only by his ego, treated her with a condescension so profound it was almost performance art. He called her the girl, our little expert, and patted her on the shoulder. The battle came over the design of the central mihrab, the prayer niche that would be the gallery's focal point. Thorne had specified a brilliant white marble from Carrara, Italy. "It's about the drama, the purity," he boomed, gesturing grandly at his renderings. "A blast of celestial white against the deep indigo of the tiles." "It's historically illiterate," Maya said calmly, her voice cutting through his theatrics. The entire room went silent. The artisans of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which this niche is meant to evoke, used marble from local Iberian quarries, pinks and creams, veined with gray. They valued the subtle imperfections, the connection to the earth beneath their feet. Your celestial white is an imposition. It's a modern Western interpretation of purity. It's sterile. We will be sourcing our marble from the Estremoz quarries in Portugal. Thorne turned a shade of plum. "That's absurd. The cost, the logistics." "I'm the architect, my dear, and I am telling you." "And I am the director," Maya interrupted, her voice still quiet but now lined with steel. "And I am telling you, the decision is made." She looked across the table at Elias Vance, who had been observing the entire exchange with unnerving stillness. It was the moment of truth. Thorne saw his opening. "Elias, surely you see the aesthetic power of my vision. We can't let this project be bogged down in dusty academic minutiae." Vance did not look at Thorne. His eyes remained on Maya. "Director Haddad has made her decision," he said, his voice flat and final. "Arrange the logistics, Marcus. I trust you are competent enough to do so." The war was over. The victory was absolute. From that day on, her word was law. Her relationship with Elias remained fiercely professional. He was a demanding, relentless employer. He read every report, questioned every line item on her budgets, and expected her to defend every choice with a mountain of evidence. Yet a new dynamic began to emerge in the quiet hours. They often found themselves as the last two people in the office, surrounded by blueprints, material samples, and scholarly texts. It was during one of these late nights, while they were examining a collection of antique astrolabes for a potential exhibit, that something shifted. Maya was explaining the intricate Kufic script engraved on a 12th century brass instrument from Toledo. "It's a city of three faiths," she murmured, tracing the lines with a gloved finger. "The script has the formal structure of Arabic, but there's a fluidity to it, a subtle influence from the Hebrew and Latin scribes he would have worked alongside. It's a conversation etched in metal." Elias reached out, his own hand hovering over the artifact. He was silent for a long time, studying the elegant, interlocking letters. "My father was a baker," he said suddenly, his voice so quiet she barely heard him. "In the North End." He spoke with that same accent I used in the restaurant. His hands were never clean. They were always covered in flour, sugar, tiny burns from the ovens. He used to say, "Elias, this is the work of a peasant. You will never work with your hands. You will work with your mind. You will build things so tall no one can ever call you the baker's son." He looked down at his own perfectly manicured hands, then back at the astrolabe. "I spent my entire life running from those hands. I built this empire of code and numbers, a world of abstract perfection, to put an entire universe between me and the smell of that bakery. When I saw you, in that uniform, I wasn't seeing you. I was seeing my own deepest fear, the fear of being him, of being small." He finally looked at her, his eyes stripped of their usual armor. "What I said to you, it was a grotesque and unforgivable thing. But the truth is, the insult was never about you. It was aimed at a ghost, my own. It wasn't an apology structured by a lawyer. It was a confession. It was the raw, unvarnished truth of him, offered up in the silent, book-filled room." "My father was a history professor at a community college," Maya replied, her own voice soft. "He made less in a year than this astrolabe is worth, but he believed that knowledge was a form of architecture. He taught me to read these lines. He used to say that a man who could build a palace was impressive, but a man who could read the soul of the culture that built it possessed the real power." She looked at Elias. "My father would have been terrified of your success, and your father would have been baffled by my career. Perhaps we are both just trying to finish a conversation they started." A new fragile understanding bloomed in the space between them, more intricate and precious than the artifact on the table. It was an acknowledgement of the shared, complicated weight of legacy. The gallery opened 18 months later to a symphony of critical acclaim. It was hailed as a triumph, a perfect marriage of scholarship and soul. At the lavish opening gala, Maya wore a simple dark blue gown, feeling like a visitor in a world she had built. She stood by the central fountain, its gentle splashing sound a calming rhythm she had designed based on the water clocks of Al-Jazari. Arthur Finch found her there, a genuine warm smile on his face. "He would have been so proud, you know," he said gently. "Your father." "I hope so," Maya whispered, her throat tightening. "He is," a voice said from behind her. Elias Vance had appeared at her side, impeccably dressed but with an uncharacteristic quietness about him. He looked not at the glittering crowd but at the art, at the light, at the textures of the space around them. "It's perfect, Maya," he said, using her first name for the first time outside of a formal document. "We made it perfect," she corrected him softly. "Yes," he agreed. "We did." He held out his hand. "There is one last detail I need you to approve." He led her away from the crowds, down a quiet corridor to a small, unassuming alcove near the manuscript collection. On the wall was a simple, elegant plaque of dark slate, engraved with the same fluid Kufic script they had admired on the astrolabe. It was the gallery's dedication. She leaned in to read the Arabic words she herself had chosen months ago. "This gallery is dedicated to the preservation of beauty and the pursuit of knowledge." But beneath it, a second line had been added, a line she had not written. "In loving memory of Dr. Samer Haddad, who taught that knowledge is the only true inheritance." Tears welled in Maya's eyes, hot and immediate. She turned to Elias, unable to speak. "Legacy isn't just about building things with your name on them," he said, his voice low and firm, meant only for her. "It's about honoring the foundations on which you were built. Your father gave you the tools. It's only right his name is on the wall." He paused, then gestured her closer to the intricate tile work framing the plaque. "Look closer." Hidden within the complex geometric patterns, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a tiny, masterful piece of calligraphy, the signature of the master artisan who had laid the tiles. But it wasn't a name, it was a phrase. She sounded it out under her breath in Arabic. Al-Ilm Nur. Knowledge is light. He wanted to sign his name, Elias explained. I suggested this instead, a secret between the artisans and us. It was the most profound gesture he could have made. Not a scholarship, not a public donation, but a hidden truth embedded in the very fabric of the building, a shared belief etched in stone. She looked from the hidden inscription to his face, the ruthless tycoon, the baker's son, the man of terrifying ambition. All those versions of him were there, but they had settled into a new, more cohesive whole. And for the first time, she gave him a smile that was not professional, not cautious, but genuine and luminously bright. He did not smile back, but something in his eyes softened, a silent acknowledgement of the vast distance they had traveled. Later that night, long after the last of the champagne had been poured and the final guest had departed, they stood alone in the center of the silent, magnificent gallery. The soft, filtered light she had fought so hard for bathed the artifacts in a gentle, timeless glow. The air was still and cool, fragrant with the scent of stone and history. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, resonant with the stories held within the walls. They stood for a long time without speaking, two unlikely partners surveying the world they had made. The ugly encounter in the restaurant felt like it had happened a lifetime ago, to two different people. It was a part of their story, the flawed, violent catalyst. But it was no longer the defining chapter. In the end, it was not the single, careless drop of crimson that had reshaped her life. It was the deep, ancient, and unyielding river of knowledge she carried inside her, a force that had, when met with the unbending will of another, carved a new and beautiful landscape for them both. The stain was gone, but the story it had written remained, etched not on paper, but on the very architecture of their lives.